Hi, this week we are covering the topic of ethnic options, and I'm pretty excited for us in recent ethnicity to dive into a more conceptual topic that looks at the intersection of race and ethnic identity, and at the same time see how that particular conceptual idea impacts on how folks form their identities on the ground and how they imagine themselves in the US multicultural context. There are a few very key readings I assigned to you, and I'm starting out here with Mary Waters' piece on optional ethnicities. So I assigned two readings from Mary Waters. This one is looking at the ethnic identity for whites or ethnic identity for European Americans. And she reminds us right at the beginning that ethnicity, just like race, has no biological basis, right? So while race is based more on physiological characteristics, often ethnicity is based on supposedly shared kinship, culture, language, etc. Her findings are based on a sample of suburban European ethnics, and she finds that there are two different kinds of options that these folks enjoy. One is to decide whether to claim any specific ancestry or to be just white, unhyphenated whites, right? So these are only folks who are just Americans. There's no hyphen involved. And the second option is which of their European ancestries they want to choose from, right? So there might be a bunch of mixes, but they might decide, I want to amplify or basically my Irish American side resonates with me the most, right? Now, here's what Waters is saying about the US context. She says these options, what she's calling ethnic options, exist for whites in the US because they are the majority group, right, both demographically as well as holding political and social power. Right? So Waters builds on the idea of symbolic ethnicity. This was the idea put forth by sociologist Herbert Gans. Symbolic ethnicity, as the name suggests, means it's somewhat of a superficial identity, right? And she points out that, again, in the US, if you recall, there are two waves of migration, right? And the first wave is happening turn of the century, and at the peak of this immigrant wave, we have Southern Central Europeans who are entering the US, and there's widespread discrimination and hostility against these newcomers, right? We have seen images of Irish need not apply, Italian Americans being stereotyped, Jewish Americans, Polish Americans being stereotyped, right? And Water says after several generations, these whites are able to move away from concentrations in the inner city to white middle class suburbia, right? And this again didn't happen naturally. The federal government invests in this after World War II, right? And hence you get what assimilationists call the melting pot, right? That you come in with all these different ethnic identities, you get melted into the pot, right? And you assimilate. So Waters is presenting more or less an instrumentalist idea of ethnicity, which is ethnicity has a purpose, right? It's a means to an end. And that end might be social mobility, achieving the American dream, and so on. So Waters says that with declining with declining discrimination, right, as these folks get melted into the pot, with increasing social mobility, there is no longer a need, right, for these European Americans to assert an ethnic identity. It doesn't serve any purpose at this point, and yet many continue to report some kind of ethnic background. Symbolic means that for these middle class white suburbanites, ethnicity is voluntary, right? It's a matter of choice with little to no effect on life chances. And this is where I've always wondered while reading Waters' work whether this ethnic identity would mean different things for people of a different social class. In other words, how would ethnicity and social class intersect and whether that would change the meanings associated with the ethnic identity. But as Waters is saying, ethnic identification is a dynamic social phenomenon. It's not fixed in time. It changes with historical political circumstances, right? So it's not an automatic labeling of an inherited characteristic. And what she finds in her case study is that most respondents are presenting ethnic culture by characteristics that she describes as little more than idiosyncratic family practices, middle class values, good solid work ethic, those kinds of things, or an oh, I have this Irish uncle who drinks a lot, so literally ethnic stereotypes and so on. So she's not finding a lot of substance, but also it's very voluntary. It's like I'm going to be Irish on St. Patrick's Day, and for the rest of the year, this doesn't really impact any of my life chances or how I live my life. So, what's the purpose of asserting this symbolic ethnicity? She says it fulfills the American need to be from somewhere, provides a sense of community, culture, with no cost to individuality or mobility, right? The second reason she's putting forth here is really important because this has important implications for race relations. And she says it's also the belief that their ancestors suffered discrimination. Thus, white ethnics don't quite understand or sympathize with the plight of racial minorities, right? Because the response, if that's the stance you're taking, is that, hey, my ancestors suffered too. And by the way, I wasn't even around when things like slavery existed. And so, just be patient, give it more time, and, stop complaining. Pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. And as you can imagine, that can really exacerbate race relations. Just to illustrate the point of the symbolic aspect of ethnicity for European Americans, you have Kathleen Delaney, who very proudly displays her Irish flag. This is very much in contrast to Obama's play on his heritage. He has had to actively address issues of race by downplaying himself, right, as a post-racial candidate. Whereas Delaney can actively bring attention to an ethnicity that would otherwise probably go unnoticed by some voters. And so you can switch out the Irish flag and think of like, how would a Mexican flag work? In which context? Which part of the country? Would it be seen as anti-American? And so on and so forth. So who are the people who can assert ethnic options? And again, we circle back to Waters saying currently in the US, it's European Americans who can have ethnic options. Because for racialized individuals, race trumps ethnicity, race overshadows ethnicity. And she concludes that Black Americans, Asian Americans, American Indians, Hispanic Americans don't have the option of a symbolic ethnicity, right? They have an ethnic identity that impacts their life chances. So white ethnics don't see this difference right? Which is where you get the fluffy version of multiculturalism. Like, oh, we're all about celebrating difference and diversity in foods and colorful outfits. But no one wants to talk about the hierarchies, right? The limits to what kind of ethnic identity is seen as acceptable, digestible versus something that is un American or against the fabric of America. And herein lies the paradox of symbolic ethnicity, right? It's hard for people possessing ethnic choice, comes with white privilege, to understand the plight of people with no choice, shaping their attitudes towards programs like affirmative action or any other anti racist kinds of policies. Ironically, though symbolic ethnicity is based on the idea of a pluralist society, right, where you have different cultures with an equal playing field, symbolic ethnicity is in fact the very idea that is keeping us from achieving a genuinely pluralist society. I assigned Miri Song's study on mixed race siblings in the UK because I thought that would offer us a really interesting comparison point. And what she finds in terms of her results are quite a bit nuanced, right? And of course, you have to compare contrast context in UK versus the US. But what we do find is that religion and nationality play a very big role, not just the racial background. Because in the UK, Muslim identity is very much the other. Just like in the US, Black identity has always been the otherized identity. In the UK, this is very much the Muslim identity, which is the otherized identity. Of course, you could argue that there are global trends too, right? But what Miri Song is saying is that there are very mixed results, right? And the black white experience is more pronounced in the sense that the kind of mix also matters, whether or not you're mixed with black. And she's talking about, again, the role of physical appearance can actually impact relationships even within the family, right? In terms of who has ethnic choice versus not. The most important thing she's finding is that the neighborhood in which you grow up, that context is really important. Because if you're in a multicultural context, then being in a mixed race family may not be very unusual. And that can have an important influence on how you form your identities, right? But she's asserting that we need to keep exploring this. We're going to have more and more mixed race families, especially with modern family forms, as you get blended families. We will see more and more the prevalence of mixed race identity, and ethnic options for this group of people will be pretty complex depending on, again, the context, the phenotype, the kind of mixture.